I'm a rabbi, I'm a former environmental attorney, former educator and educational administrator, and above all else, I'm the son of an immigrant from Iran and an African-American mother who raised me in the ghetto in Newark, New Jersey, and in Jersey City, New Jersey, and had very high hopes for me, very high hopes under trying circumstances. I was raised in a family that was working poor, struggled very hard to keep food on the table and to make ends meet. And for me, I always saw as the ticket out education. And so I kept my head in a book and tried not to look too much or too hard at the circumstances, the trying circumstances around me and outside of those four walls. I worked very hard to get from that circumstance to an Ivy League education and through 3 law degrees. But one thing that always stuck with me was the feeling of being in the midst of that struggle and understanding what it meant for all the people from circumstances like mine and all the people raised in communities like mine. I feel when you have that opportunity, as hard one as it is, to see your way out of those circumstances through hard work, through education, one of the things you have to recognize is all of the people for whom that hasn't happened, for whom that struggle continues. And those tools that you've been given, you have a responsibility to use them to help improve their situation. And that's what I've tried to do on a very personal level. I'm very actively engaged in a number of different causes in my local community and education, of course, but also being an elected official in education, I understood very early on that as someone from the perspective I have, that whatever capital, social capital, political capital that I earned for being elected official, I had a responsibility to ensure that that was used for causes that gave a voice to the voiceless. And so I'm proud to be pretty much the only elected official in my area that's been as outspoken as I've been against fracking. And this is an issue that affects many communities, but it affects ours because you see, and I like to remind people of this frequently, all of these things are connected to each other. They're spokes off of the same wheel of, unfortunately, what is an abusive, hyper-capitalist system. When I talk about the educational issues happening in Youngstown, and how we're subject to a state takeover, and students are subjected to a cycle of failure that funnels them into a school-to-prison pipeline, I can't ignore the fact that the same neighborhoods, the same students, are also subjected to earthquakes due to fracking, and that this system we belong to, for the sake of profit and racism that goes along with this hyper-capitalist system. The system just feels as if neighborhoods like ours, people of color in neighborhoods like ours, don't deserve to have a fair shake at education and don't deserve to have clean air, water, and soil. We are dealing with educational racism, environmental racism, racism in terms of healthcare inequalities, socioeconomic inequality in this country. We have a wide gap between the haves and the have-nots, and between the privileged and the not so privileged in this country. And it's time that we have voices step to the forefront to speak for the voiceless and the oppressed. And that's what this party and what our campaign is about. This campaign is about the voices of the oppressed moving to the forefront and leading an agenda of equality for all. And what is that going to look like? How do we deal with this system which at its root, because of these capitalist abuses, has imprisoned people in a cycle of despair for generations? Well, the first thing I like to lead with is a discussion of the democratic deficit, because all of the ways in which we want to change this system are not going to be able to come to fruition until we deal with the fact that essentially the people have been cut off from the means of affecting change in this country. We have corporations. corporations who are controlling the two-party duopoly and making all the decisions over your life and death. We have a system whereby voter ID laws have prevented people from voting and contributed to racism in our so-called democratic system. We have a system that says corporations are people. And let's make no bones about it. What does that mean in reality? In reality, it means that corporations are being treated preferentially to people. They are being treated better than people. And the influx of corporate money has perverted the political agenda. We need proportional representation. We need ranked choice to give increased democratic choice to our voters. And we need to end corporate personhood and bring down citizens united. These are basic democratic reforms that we need in this country, and they are the basis for what will be an agenda that will overturn this system as we know it. From that bedrock, we will get things such as the Green New Deal. A lot of conversation has taken place about this, about what it means. It's been sidelined by various New Deals, plural, coming out of Democratic Party back rooms designed to siphon off support for genuine change with a window dressing version of the Green New Deal. You have people like Cuomo saying, well, we're going to have 100% renewable energy for your electricity needs. Well, what about transportation? What about the massive amounts of pollution related to that? We know better. The Green Party has been invested in solutions on these issues for many, many years. And these people are trying to co-opt the agenda and steal away attention from a country that recognizes there's a serious problem and is for the first time starting to wake up to and listen to the solutions that we have. So we have to be full-throated about advocating for the real Green New Deal. We're talking about 100% renewable energy. We're talking about, in every regard, we're talking about revamping our approach to transportation in this country. We are talking about mass transit solutions that are not only going to be greener, but are going to connect communities in meaningful ways and give people greater access to resources. And we're talking about millions of new green jobs. You have people who have felt the appeal in their minds of Trump saying to various hard-scrabble communities, we're going to bring coal back, we're going to bring steel back in my part of the country. It's not happening, it's not coming, and that doesn't mean that the jobs and the opportunities aren't. Because this Green New Deal provides a whole world of new opportunities for new jobs and for advancement of an agenda that will save this planet. Because we need to. It is a necessity. We have limited years to resolve this problem. Scientists have made that very clear. And we have to band together for the solutions necessary to make this happen. Now, when I talk about the Green New Deal, and I talk about how we need to resolve this environmental issue, this pressing environmental issue, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention something our campaign calls the People of Color Bill of Rights, a new deal for people who have been given a raw deal for generations, for centuries. And when I talk about these things together, it's important to underline the following. People often think of our party as a purely environmental party. Yes, we're focused on the environment. Yes, we're focused on saving this planet. It is a high priority on our agenda. But when I explain to people what the Green Party is about, I often tell them the Green Party is the party of justice. Justice for the earth and all its people. That's our agenda. That's what we're advancing. And so, when we talk about the Green New Deal and saving our planet, we also talk about the rights of people of color in this country, which have not been respected over centuries. And so our New Deal for people of color recognizes whatever rights we have on the books in this country, the translation of those rights into practice is such that people have been shut out, effectively shut out of this system. The justice system is one such aspect of this. And when I talk about the school to prison pipeline, I have to mention the fact that we have a broken justice system, an injustice system, where people do not have equal access to justice. You have people who've been failed by this educational system. Youths, African-American youths, who find themselves caught up in the justice system, and then their case is brought before a public defender, and they spend all of about 30 seconds looking at their case before telling them, you should plead guilty. You should plead guilty and take whatever years they give you. That's unacceptable. That's not how our system is supposed to work, and we need to have a more robust system, ensuring we have more attorneys, more qualified attorneys, and smaller dockets to deal with these cases and do the work that's supposed to happen under a genuine public defender system, defend and vindicate the public's rights. We have to deal with the fact that we have a genocide on our streets. People of color being murdered by law enforcement. A very grim anniversary just passed. The 22nd of November is the 5-year anniversary of the murder of Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old, murdered by police in my state, in Ohio. How much has changed since then? Not at all. We still haven't gotten the true community control over policing that we need to resolve these problems and end the murders, the genocide on these streets. Let me be clear what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about toothless citizen oversight boards. I am talking about transforming what started as a fugitive slave retrieval force, because that was the origin of policing in this country. Transforming that into a force that genuinely serves and protects the public, because the public has control and say over what they do and will hold them accountable. No more show trials where they exonerate people who have murdered people on these streets for little more than the fact that they happen to be black. It has to end. We have to talk about the banking and finance industry in this country that continues to redline communities. Redline communities and draw those lines between races, between haves and have-nots, in ways that have had catastrophic results. Decades since the CRA, since the Carter era, when they invested political will in trying to resolve this problem, it still hasn't been solved. And it hasn't been solved because many banks have pretty much gotten around those rules and continue to engage in practices that allows redlining to go on in our major urban centers. We must tackle the finance and the banking industry and the inequalities that they perpetuate in our society. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the issue of indigenous people's sovereignty. When I'm talking about the 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination against people of color, against black people in this country, and when I'm talking about reparations for black people, for descendants of African slaves, which we believe strongly in as a party, we also have to talk about the reparative process that's going to be necessary in order to heal those wounds in the indigenous people's communities that were caused by the amount of racism, land theft, theft of sovereignty from those peoples. We have to invest in and protect Native people's sovereignty in this country. And there's so many ways in which we need to deal with the inequalities presented to people of color in this country. Our campaign has a focused, a targeted approach to doing so, and these are the messages that need to be brought to the forefront in 2020, because they are the messages people need to hear. We are going to have a tough race in 2020, and it is going to be said to those of us progressive warriors, why don't you just get out of the way of the corporatist, so-called, air quotes, progressives from the Democratic Party, and let them march into this race with their corporate owners and backers and take on the Orange Menace. Do you know why? Why we're not going to let them do that? Because they've failed us, election after election, generation after generation, and when you want to talk about how and why we got the Orange Menace, they're the reason why. Because people keep They keep buying into this message of lesser of two evils. Here's a simple message that we present. We are not bought out by anyone. We're not bought out by the corporations. We are here to vindicate your rights and fight for equality for all. And we don't want you to pick anything evil. You should never have to choose even the slightest bit of evil. There's no need to choose a lesser of two evils in a true democracy. And we want people to use that choice to vote their values, and most of America agrees with us on the problems they see every day and face every day, and that we are the only party that has solutions for. So that brings me to such elemental issues as single-payer healthcare. I spent an early part of the day talking about healthcare for all. I come from a family where, in my mother's case, just going to the doctor is a bit of an ordeal for her because she thinks about the Tuskegee experiment. Can I trust the medical profession? And you can forgive her for not wanting to trust the medical profession. Studies have shown that doctors see, in their mind's eye, people of color as capable of taking more pain than other people and give them less painkillers. How horrible and horribly racist is that? So when we talk about single-payer healthcare and giving healthcare to all, you could give people a shiny new card that says they're going to have access to X, Y, and Z, but if the doctors they're dealing with aren't giving them an equal standard of care, if they don't have clinics in their neighborhoods that can serve them at all or serve them adequately, or if they live in neighborhoods where fresh produce is not available because, like in my neighborhood, we do not have a supermarket, how are they expected to have an equal standard of quality, healthful living? It's not going to be possible. So healthcare has to be not just a discussion of providing universal, single-payer healthcare. It has to be a discussion of how we provide equal access to good health for everyone. And that is a community-building discussion. And so our campaign is advancing, yes, a national model for universal single-payer healthcare, but one that involves community buy-in in every community across this country. Communities building up together a healthcare infrastructure with access to local clinics, and aided, of course, by the other aspects of inequality that we will conquer together, because if you cannot find transport to your local clinic, you also do not have access to health care. Our mass transit system, which we will develop together, will help provide access to all of the amenities of a quality standard of living. And when I talk about building up communities and providing power, giving power back to the people, democratic power, power over policing, power over healthcare, giving people a universal access and right to housing, food, water, all of the necessities of life. We have to also talk about not just what's happening within the borders of this country, but how this country is or isn't contributing to a more peaceful, more healthy, more successful planetary existence. This country is a country where we spend massive amounts on war. Bookmark that word, war, because we often talk about this issue and people talk about a defense budget. It's a war budget. This country is engaging in warmongering all over the world. And when we have the conversation about how we're going to fund and provide for health care, we often have people say back to us, where are you going to find the money? Did you ask that question when we had our last war? You found the money to drop bombs on people of color in parts of the world that some of your leaders can't pick out on a map. But you couldn't find the money to provide health care for people in your own neighborhood. We have to change our priorities as a country. We have to prioritize human and planetary fulfillment, and it begins with committing ourselves to ending war and investing in peace. We aren't just going to slash that quote-unquote defense budget. We're going to cut the war budget and divert what funds have been given to it to a Department of Peace. Because we strongly believe that the best defense is a well-educated citizenry, a strong infrastructure, and building fruitful diplomatic relationships with other nations of the world, shoulder to shoulder as equals. Look at the world around us today. We're in the midst of a coup in Bolivia, a US-backed coup, imperialist coup. Let's call it what it is. And many people have thrown around statements such as, well, there's election fraud according to the OAS. The same OAS the US has funded to support their imperialist efforts. There is a media campaign to trick people into thinking that we need to exert resources, money, energy in depriving people of democratic choice in other countries. They elected Morales in Bolivia, and we as a country are engaged in a coup against that democracy. Take what's happening in Israel-Palestine. The United States of America is funding a country that is fundamentally depriving Palestinians of their human rights. And the country we are funding, that think about this for a moment, as they deprive Palestinians of their human rights, as we divert our attentions to funding them and engaging in the war that they're exerting upon other peoples, they have a better healthcare system than we do. I know that for a fact. I lived there for 2 years. Why are we funding the discord and war that they're engaging in, while they provide a better standard of care and health care than we do, and depriving our own citizens? It's absurd, it's obscene, it's unconscionable. We need to not only support freedom movements like the movement to free Palestine, we need to support the effort to remove imperialism and colonialism all over this planet. That is what we should fund, defend, and support. We need to close the 700 plus bases all over this world. The only bases should stay open are bases for peacekeeping purposes with the agreement of those countries and the UN, and those would be very, very few, folks. And we need to invest in something our campaign is calling the Green Path Forward. And it's the extension of the Green New Deal, because we recognize that if we're going to resolve this climate crisis, this man-made climate change crisis, we need to recognize that the solution does not lie in what we do between New Jersey and California. It is a planetary crisis. And so the countries that we have been trained to hate are the same countries we need to learn how to engage in more fruitful diplomacy with to solve this crisis. The top of the list in carbon emissions are countries such as China and Russia. And we're in the midst of a misinformation campaign that's trying to train us to hate them and to not engage with them. We need to be having fruitful conversations with them about how we resolve this climate crisis together. We need to stop the outsourcing of our carbon footprint, because that's why China's emissions are so high. And part of the reason why they're so high is because the manufacturing that takes place there and then provides products that are purchased here is providing carbon emissions there. That's our footprint, outsourced to other countries. It must stop. And we must deal with the plastics crisis as well. We've got plastics in the deepest part of fragile ocean ecosystems, and we must commit ourselves to holding producers, corporate producers, responsible. And that as a general principle is how we should engage with the rapacious corporations that have deprived people of their rights and polluted communities and neighborhoods. Whether it's plastic producers that don't seem to care where their products end up, or it's companies stealing local water in states like Maine. Poland Spring, otherwise known as Stolen Spring, is one of the big culprits in that. Nestle is a big, big part of this story. And besides the pollution that comes from the many water bottles they put out there, the water theft is depriving people of their basic human rights. Basic human right to food, to water, to clean air, to soil. These are the things that we are best positioned to protect. And so, as a general concept, our approach is an end to privilege. That's the best way to sum up our platform approach. Whether it's racial privilege, economic privilege, male privilege, which I admit and concede exists. I have cisgender privilege, straight privilege, as an openly gay man, something I'm very well aware of. We want to bring an end to privilege and have a society where people have a genuinely equal opportunity to participate. And that's what I'm asking you all to be a part of, because it isn't going to work unless we all band together and decide it is time. It is time to make it happen. It is time to get out there and be the path to that success. It's time to raise awareness about all these issues that corporations, through their puppet-mastered representatives in our Congress, these elected representatives, have been obscuring the solutions that we've needed for decades. It's time to break through that wall, through the media blockade, and through all of that corporate money, and get the message to the people and get them on board with this effort to change this system fundamentally to end privilege. So I thank you for having me here. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I would love to entertain any questions that you have.
I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about, particularly, it sounds like you've got some local expertise relative to education and working with the school board. And it seems to me that structurally, because we've based education funding on property taxes, which inherently are a way of saying we're going to allow rich people to have more money spent on their kids than we are poor people. Just the way we fund schools altogether, instead of providing equal funding for every child in the state, we get this disparity. And on the other, and then coupled with that, I'm kind of interested in this rise of the wealth tax idea. In that, if I'm a middle class person, probably the only way I accumulate any wealth in my life is I buy a house, and 10 years later, it's worth 20% more, and I'm now taking that as something that I've done that's wonderful, and my net value has gone up. And at the same time, why is the Van Gogh or the stock portfolio that's going up to somebody else not income in the same way, and why shouldn't that pay for it? So I'm just wondering how you would see taxation as one of the ways that we might get at more equal funding to provide more equal schools across the union.
It's a great question, and I'll just speak to start with my personal experience. As a member of the Youngstown, Ohio School Board, we are dealing with a school district that has experienced an exodus, frankly, from the city. One of the largest downturns in terms of population for an urban area over the past number of decades in this country. People often point to Detroit for that, but our statistics are just as dire, if not worse in some regards, because our city has been halved. We were a city of about 120K that went down to 65. So there's been a mass exodus, there's been abandonment of homes, blight has resulted, but one of the things that's definitely resulted is you have less people occupying homes, you have less money coming in property taxes. Now, part of that's been offset by the fact that we have less students. Well, a large part of that's been offset by the fact we have less students. And even those who live in the city now and raise families in the city, a good portion of them send their kids to schools outside of the city, private schools, Catholic schools, things of that sort. But we found, particularly under state takeover, as soon as the state takeover took place, we found that we had a glut of tax abatement requests. We had vultures just setting in on the city. and companies saying, you know, you should be happy. Their position is pretty much, you should be happy that we're coming to this blighted, dying city and setting up a corporate base. You should be happy. No, you're coming here and saying, we don't want to invest in your kids. We want a free ride. So yes, absolutely, dealing with the taxation issue is a part of this, and making people pay a fair share and pay into our system to pay for education. But that's not the only part of the story, because when we talk about the economic inequalities, it goes much deeper than that. We have to restructure entirely our system and reorient our financial priorities. Just as we've managed to find money to wage war, we can find that money for a mobilization to improve education. And we must take whatever resources at our disposal in order to deal with the educational crisis. And the reason why it's not happening, the reason why educational issues have been allowed to fester is because, and I hope I don't blow any minds in this crowd because I think this is a very woke crowd, they don't want you to be educated, especially in communities like mine. The miss or the undereducation is how they perpetuate this system. It's how they manage to convince you generation after generation that you don't have a choice, that you don't have a voice, that you have to pick one of two boxes marked either D or R. It's how they keep the whole game going. If we had a genuinely robust educational system, we'd be able to break through those barriers. And when you talk about parts of this country that have an education system that's better off than ours, the people who are receiving that are not the people in communities like mine with the demographics like mine. The people in communities like mine with the racial demographics like mine are exactly the communities that this system doesn't want to be educated, because once they are, they will become empowered and they will raise a mighty noise that will bring this system down. We need to invest in education, and it needs to come from as many resources we have at our disposal. In communities like Youngstown, you cannot depend simply on property taxes in a place where the property tax base is ever decreasing. And we do get state funding for our educational initiatives. So we get money that comes from outside of the property taxes that are paid in our community. There are many ways that we can fund and invest in education. And all these people that sit around and twiddle their thumbs, the Betsy DeVosses of the world, and act like, well, you know, I guess you should all just go to also failing and crumbling charter schools. We got the means. We have the resources. We just don't have the political will. So it's time to start knocking on our representatives' doors and demanding that they do something about this crumbling educational system. Now, tax the rich. Yes, they need to pay more of their fair share. But here's what that strikes me as, particularly when it comes from Democratic candidates. It strikes me as something that has been used and misused often to sweep under the carpet all the many abuses of this system. If you tell people, we're going to take a bigger slice off of the rich, then it just gets people more comfortable with the idea of the fact that we have super, uber rich people in this country. How did we get that is the question you need to ask. Where did the money come from? How does this 1% perpetuate itself? They do so off of the backs of people who have been systematically abused and disenfranchised, off of workers who do not make a living wage. And so that extra slice you're taking from them is barely even a dent in the systematic abuse that they're engaging in that continues to pour undeserved money into their coffers. So yeah, make them pay more, but also completely upend the system so that they don't abuse people and profit off of their suffering. Bring down the whole apple cart of hypercapitalism in this country. Create a system where we democratize the money supply, and so that we have control over the money supply instead of banks creating money. These are the things that we need to do to bring about genuine system change, and I have a very side-eyed view of Democratic candidates in particular who use tax the rich as a way of getting you to not look behind the curtain on this abusive system. So, yes?
Two questions. One is, do you see the Green Party as having no enemies, let's say? That's number one question. And number two, how would you specifically address, like, for lack of a better word, gun control in the country? just to give me a flavor of how you would approach this kind of issue or problem. Yeah.
Both great questions. I mean, I guess it goes back to the earlier statement about, at its root, corporations taking away the right of people to have voice and choice, because they're the ones pulling the strings on your representatives that are blocking you from true democracy. And so, you know, I don't know that I would say the Green Party has quote unquote enemies, but we have people that we
Like
are
North
not
Korea
in
is
league
not
with.
an enemy, and China is not an enemy, and there are no enemies to the Green Party. Is that accurate?
I would say that we need to, if we're talking about, you know, a diplomatic
I mean, it's
view,
okay
an
with me. I'm not
international,
looking for
if we're talking about an international diplomatic view, we have to take the approach of being willing to have conversations with and standing shoulder to shoulder with countries to bring about peace. And so, as opposed to a very right-wing perspective in politics and in diplomacy, which we've seen not work for many, many years, of pointing out countries and saying, you are the axis of evil, and you are this, and you are that. Definitely there are countries, there are leaders that are fomenting discord and war and negativity and toxicity in the world. We need to talk to nations in order to build peace, instead of building up a military-industrial complex that creates this fear on both sides of the fence and then puts itchy fingers on triggers. We need to have these conversations to build a more stable and a peaceful world. So if we're talking about enemies amongst other nations, what we're about is tearing down those barriers. And many of the countries you've been told are enemies, that saber rattling serves a purpose that does us and the world no good. Domestically, I would say that we have an enemy in hypercapitalism and corporations profiting off of people's suffering. We don't take money from corporations. We're definitely on the other side of the fence of that, as opposed to the two-party system that is taking money from these corporations. And we're very proud of that. The second part of your question?
Yeah, about gun control.
Gun control. Gun
Whatever
control.
you wanna call it. I don't care about control necessarily, but just what would be your approach to the amount of guns on the streets and murder?
Well, for one thing, we have loopholes that need to be closed. These private sale loopholes that don't involve background checks, that's a serious problem. Also, as a lawyer, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the issue of gun manufacturers' liability. Once again, we're back to corporations. They've been isolated, they've been insulated from the ability to take legal responsibility for the things that they put out there. That has to end. The shielding from liability has to end. But we also have to connect back with the earlier statement that I made about empowering communities. Because we do have communities that are feeling empowered to take this issue into their hands, to deal with the effects of guns on their streets. Chicago would be an example of that. But when they tried to do that, they got slapped down. And this preemption is something that is not just an issue for gun control. It reminds me very distinctly of the preemption that exists in regards to fracking, because local communities in Ohio tried to raise their voice about that and then suffered from the smackdown of state preemption. So what I'm saying is that communities need to feel empowered and be given the tools to be able to handle issues like that. If a local community wants to bring in controls and regulations that they feel appropriate for that community, they need to be supported in those empowering efforts. And that's something that I'm in favor of, and that's something that a lot of Greens are in favor of. So we need to have common sense responses to gun control and common sense approaches to empowering communities to be able to tackle these issues, rather than the efforts that are coming out of your local representatives who were bought and paid for by the NRA and other interests. Any other questions?
How would you build mass transportation, particularly mass transportation in rural areas?
It's a great question. You know, there are a number of proposals and solutions for this. And the rural dimension of this is particularly important, because it's easy for me to talk about a place like Youngstown, Ohio, and say, you know, we're going to build more rapid transit there, we're going to have more connecting routes so that people can get, you know, from home to the clinic, to the supermarket. But in rural areas, you'll have much wider spaces. And so I believe very strongly in building a strong rail infrastructure in this country. Proposals have come forward for something called solutionary rail, which I find very interesting. Rail that's going to also help generate energy, while it's moving, and I find that to be a very interesting set of solutions. But we need to build a stronger rail infrastructure across this country, including in rural areas, especially in places that are not well connected. I come from the state of Ohio, and it's got a number of urban areas with interspersed rural spaces, large, wide rural spaces. But most of them do not have passenger rail running through it at all. And when we deal with the problem of urban areas not being connected, we can also deal with the problem of rural areas not being connected, building routes that will pass through those areas and connect with urban centers. Ohio has the largest metro area in the country that doesn't have passenger rail service. That would be Columbus, Ohio. And if you were to send passenger rail service through Columbus, Ohio, it would also be passing through a number of rural areas and wide open spaces. We need to build a stronger network, a wider network across this country. We need to invest in high-speed rail and rapid transit in a way that's environmentally sensitive, because some of these projects in other parts of the world have bulldozed over fragile ecosystems. But we need to invest in that, and that is very much a part of the Green New Deal, building that infrastructure. Yes?
I just want to say that in our community, we had, Amtrak was subsidizing our local bus system, things that could bring people to the Amtrak station, which was like 45 minutes from here, 45 minutes. And then you could go to San Francisco, Sacramento, blah, blah, blah. Well, when they stopped supplementing, or subsidizing, sorry, the local community here, now the buses, our buses come to the train station either, 10 minutes late, 5 minutes late. So they miss the connections.
Mm-hmm.
It's like absurd. I mean, to me, it's absurd. Why would they, you want to punish Amtrak, or you want to punish your local, you want to punish people who need to go to the Bay Area? I just don't get it.
I'm going to blow your mind again after my statement about them not wanting people to be educated. They also don't want you to find success in managing your life through mass transit and connecting with people through mass transit. That doesn't make as much money as you and your neighbor and everyone else riding up and down town in a gas guzzler. Look, the technology for example, electric cars, that was available to us very, very early on in the automotive revolution, so to speak. And that was stymied. Oil and gas, the money from oil and gas looms large. They ripped up all the interurban trolley systems across this country. And it's interesting because my old hometown in Jersey City, in the beds, the train beds and the systems that were ripped up, they built a new light rail system. Why did you get rid of the first system then? Why did you get rid of the first rail system? Just rip it up just to have to put it up again. We need these solutions. They're shielding us from these solutions because they don't make as much profit for deeply entrenched oil and gas interests. We need to invest in transit that works. We need to invest in transit that is readily available, that runs on a regular schedule, that people can use and depend on and rely on. And that will be so accessible to people that rather than getting in your gas-guzzling car or spending the amount on insurance, which in some states is astronomical, you will simply get on a light rail, various forms of clean transit that will run on a regular schedule, and you will get from point A to point B. We can have that, and we know we can have that because compared to what we have now, we once did have that. They ripped it all up for profit. So we need to go back to that perspective at least, only using the new technology and the advances that we've gained in order to provide cleaner transportation, more deeply enmeshed with people's everyday needs. Yes?
I have a question about the public transit, or not even public, but let's say green transportation as it relates to these lithium batteries. And there's only going to be so much lithium, and so what's plan B?
It's a great question because some of the technology, some of the precious metals being used in batteries are themselves toxic and also relate to conflicts in other countries. It's a very timely point. Bolivia, I just took the words right out of my mouth because that's what they're getting at in Bolivia.
They also pollute the creation of the batteries
Yes.
themselves, causes that.
You know, there are many different clean energy solutions available, and they don't all have to depend on things like lithium or what it takes to get them from other countries. And that's why I take a lot of strength from the various kinds of solutionary real proposals that have been presented, because there are ways of getting around those toxic elements. The technology is available and out there, and a part of the larger scheme of bringing about renewable energy through wind power, through solar power, and providing energy through our solutionary rail systems. I also have a strong concern about those battery systems that are going to be problematic. I think that when we talk about battery systems in electric cars, some electric cars for instance, I think part of the solution to that is to encourage more mass transit usage and to build systems that don't depend on that kind of toxicity. And I think that's something that's going to be a cultural shift. We have to engage in a national cultural shift towards awareness that not only brings about a wider mass transit network, but encourages more people to use mass transit and builds up political will for clean forms of mass transit that will be readily available and accessible to everyone. Now, in response to this, you know, I've been accused of, by some people, making them feel guilty for using their cars. That's not what we're doing here. We're making people feel free from being chained to their gas-guzzling vehicles. When you really think about everyday commerce, people get in their car, use their car to drive from point A to point B because they feel the necessity and or the convenience. When you remove the barriers and you build up the convenience through mass transit and you apply technologies that we know are available or out there that don't have to involve all these toxic chemicals, that don't have to involve elements that we're taking from troubled places that our country is constantly trying to invade. When we do that, we will be able to find a form of transportation that works and is accessible for all, and the compulsion to have your own individual gas-guzzling vehicle will decrease. That's what we're talking about here. And we're talking about moving away from dependence on elements such as lithium, as you mentioned. We have to get out of that. We have to get out of that business because it's killing us in more ways than one. It's killing us in terms of our relationship with other countries. Yes?
I'd kind of like your sort of top-level view of local organizing. We're a small rural county. When we have a meeting of the Green Party, we're sometimes lucky to have 15 people come.
Mm-hmm.
We all sit around and make each other feel really good about how wonderful things are. And I think, you know, if I picture our next meeting after being here today and all the things we talked about, but from banking to fracking to single-payer healthcare, and then I say to myself, having been kind of off the field for 5 months, okay, let's get something done. And how are we going to do that? And there's only a few of us sitting here to start out. What's your experience is the best way to move forward and balance getting a few local wins as opposed to, it feels like sitting here today, I'm not going to do very much about fracking, much as I would like to, or I could go participate in a fracking demonstration somewhere else, and how's that going to translate to building a local organization? So just your view of the most effective way of building a grassroots movement, starting with a relatively small number of people.
Great question, great points. I also, in many things that I do, I'm also a local Green leader. I'm the chair of the Mahoning County Green Party, which is the county that Youngstown, Ohio is in. Currently the only elected Green in the state of Ohio. And so when you're in that circumstance, when you're in a Midwestern state where despite despite Democratic Party control in Youngstown, is a very conservative state in between all the urban areas. There's a lot of right-wing Republicanism everywhere in between urban areas. Sometimes seems a little bit bleak. So how do you make things happen? How do you get that awareness out there?
Sometimes it feels bleak,
It feels bleak a lot of the
very,
time.
little bit.
Feels bleak a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Well, look. Let's be real about it and put an underlining under how it feels bleak. Because the state takeover we're experiencing in education, we're a district with 70% black students, 14% Hispanic, so overwhelmingly students of color, and a state government is coming in that represents a state that is 80% white, and is coming in and taking control and voice and say from parents of students of color. So that's how stark, that's how bleak it is. We're fighting that juggernaut and that institutional racism. It's one of the things we're dealing with. How do we deal with it? When we talk about community organizing, it's easier said than done. We need to get out of our comfort zones. That's number one. And so when I look around the table at these meetings that I attend as the chair of the Mahoney County Green Party, one of the things I notice is that there's not a lot of people there that look like me. There's not a lot of people that look like me or come from the circumstances that I come from. How do you deal with that? How do you remedy that? Considering the fact that these solutions we have as a party, the solutions in our platform, they are the best solutions out of any of the parties out there to deal with the everyday issues that people of color are facing in this country. But they've never heard, most of them have never heard of it in our community. And that's because we need to get out of our comfort zones. And so things that I say to people around that round table are, have you been to local black churches? Why? Because the local Democratic Party already has a foothold there and they're going on a regular basis. They are connected and hooked in to this pastor, to that pastor, to the other pastor. Are you going where people are? Are you going to community events? Are you connecting with other organizations that are fellow travelers in the same cause? Because guess what? Whether they do or don't belong to the Green Party, if their aim is to pass a community bill of rights that gets rid of fracking, it doesn't matter for that issue what party you belong to. You need to work together with whoever's going to achieve that end. And when you do that, and you make those things happen, people can point to achievements from your party that show your leadership in that area. We as a campaign believe very strongly in something we're calling #SeeGreensLead. And that's our investment as a campaign in supporting people running for local office so that they, once they get into that office, can engage in impactful change that gives people examples of what it means to be a green in leadership. So there's that dimension of it as well. Getting out of your comfort zones, getting people elected to local office, and then working their way up, because unlike the corporate parties, we don't have millions of dollars to throw in one shot at a Senate race to have someone who comes from the corporate private sector go straight into the US Senate, which sometimes happens for those corporate parties. But people do often recognize local leaders in their area who have fought for their causes, who have worked their way up from school board to city council to mayor to whatever, and then to Congress. If we want to see a real breakthrough there, we have to start local and start small and build up all across the country. A large national effort, but on a ground floor community basis. And that's what we're doing locally. That's what we're endeavoring to do on issues like fracking, on issues like reform in municipal elections. I've been a plaintiff in a number of CELDEF lawsuits against fracking, but also actively engaged in efforts to pass free and fair elections like local legislation. And I'm sure you have experience with that here in California. Ours was inspired in part by developments here. So that's how it spreads. It starts in local areas and then it spreads out to the rest of the country. And that's how I believe we're going to make the breakthrough. Now I want to connect this to this national race, this presidential race, because then people say, well, why don't you just focus on that? Why even run a candidate for president? Get out of the way and let the Democrat win. Here's the reality, folks. We need not only to run a presidential candidate because in some places our ballot access depends upon it, We need to run a presidential candidate because we need to provide people with that choice that reflects their values. That's what a presidential candidate can do. And also a presidential candidate can mobilize this national effort that we have in order to build up stronger local communities and local environmental, green, justice-oriented efforts. And that's what our campaign seeks to do, and that's what we're looking for people to get on board with. And 2020 is going to be a real challenge, folks. It's going to be a real challenge because we're facing almost as ugly as it gets. We thought the Bush administration was, but I guess Trump taught us some more lessons since then. Now, more than ever, we need to show people that different solutions are possible, and that we've got those answers that are going to provide solutions to their everyday struggle. Anyone else? Yes?
Okay, I got one for you, Dario. Can you, do you have any thoughts about the connection between climate change and the meat industry?
Oh, excellent question. You know, I happen to be a vegan, and that's a recent choice that I made for a number of reasons, but really, after spending some time reducing my meat consumption, because I had qualms about the effects of meat consumption on our environment, on our planet. If you don't know, for instance, a pound of chicken takes about roughly 500 gallons of water to produce. It's a lot of resources to go into that 1 pound of meat. This is the only way in which agribusiness has affected our planet. So recognizing all of that, I began to personally reduce my meat consumption. But then I just felt that my personal choices didn't completely reflect my values. And that's why I made the choice to become vegan, because I enjoy sitting down to a meal where I know that not a single animal has been abused to produce that food. That's something I take personal enjoyment and satisfaction out of. Do I think that everyone has to become vegan? That's not what our campaign is advancing. What I believe is that everyone should take a planet-conscious and animal rights-conscious view of their food. And think about all of the uses that go into providing some of the food on your table. Think about the atrocities going on in places like that ranch that I passed on the way up here, the Harris Ranch. Just a sea of animals. It just makes you feel emotional. If you weren't already vegan as I am, you look at that, those animals being mistreated and readied for slaughter, you want to go off meat. It's disgusting. But then when you think about this in the larger sense, and you realize that footage that you see on TV, on CNN, that people cried over, of the Amazon in flames, that ecosystem that provides such benefits to us, those trees, that ecosystem provides such benefit to us by providing cleaner air to all of us. And of course, the habitats, the fragile ecosystems, the indigenous people who depended upon it. So many of us watched it and had tears in our eyes over it, but watched a media that didn't emphasize as much how that came about. Bolsonaro let loose ranchers to have their way with the Amazon. And that's where all of that's where that came from. The rapacious effects of agribusiness. We must deal with that here and abroad. And when we talk about supporting agriculture, small organic agriculture, we have to contend with the agribusiness giants that have abused animals' rights, that have contributed to a culture of overconsumption that does us no good health-wise, but also does the planet no good from overuse of resources. We have to tackle all of those things. And when we do that, when we deal with that earnestly and honestly, we must also commit ourselves to building a very different culture on these issues than we have in the past. You cannot turn on television without seeing a commercial with a dripping, juicy hamburger. Do I think that no one should ever be able to eat a hamburger again? That's not what I'm advancing. What I'm advancing is that we have a toxic culture that encourages people to stuff themselves full of food that does them no good. That's what I'm saying. And so we need to not only deal with the political will aspect of this by tackling agribusiness, we also need to be a part of the awareness effort that changes the culture in this country so that we can make choices that are not only healthier for us and our families, but are healthier for the planet. Any other questions? Yes?
This is very, very, very broad. The reason I'm agreeing is mainly because within the 10 key values, it actually addresses the ageless, urban versus rural dichotomy in politics, and especially in California, because what we're seeing is the Democratic and Republican parties play this out perfectly, and I think it's orchestrated, where the Democrats really focus on urban areas, Republicans really focus on rural areas. Then all of a sudden all the money that comes from urban areas comes to places like this and gentrify it, and now we have a homeless issue. Goes to what you were just talking. I mean, it goes across the spectrum. It goes. Every issue is based on this premise that there's an urban and a rural divide. And the way I believe the Green Party could forward themselves is actually respecting and representing rural people, because a lot of Greens in California, the majority of them live in urban areas, especially on the coast. So Greens, generally in conservative, more rural areas, don't have very good representation or reputations. So do you see a bridge where you can actually show rural America, because you have a national office, how do we connect that red middle with green values? Because I think it does.
It does, absolutely. We're the best positioned party to serve rural parts of this country, because we are the party that's going to generally provide the solutions that are going to connect people across long distances. We're the party that's going to invest in organic agriculture. It's going to invest in farmers across this country. These are people who have been forgotten by the system that is supposedly advocating for their interests. They've been trained to believe that to be the case, but the reality is when it comes to issues like agriculture, it's agribusiness that's really getting the benefit from many of these right-wing representatives that prevail in rural areas. And I'm going to tell you something, because other parts of the world and some parts of this country have recognized that and defied the dichotomy that you're describing. When we talk about the history of Medicare and Medicaid, we have to go back to what happened in Saskatchewan decades upon decades ago. North America's first socialist government. This was a government that prevailed in a rural province, a province that still is not, by any means, very urban. It doesn't have many people in it to this day, but it was even more rural then. And the basic wisdom behind it, and Tommy Douglas's socialist government in Saskatchewan, was this idea of neighbors helping neighbors, which was always readily understandable and apparent to them from that cultural perspective. If you needed help and you were having a hard time and you had a bad harvest, everyone understood that when you helped out each other, it helped out everyone. And that laid a framework culturally for universal health care there. And we took our cue from that. And so it's become such a perverse political inversion to tell rural America, watch out for those left-wing Greens and for socialists because we are the ones who are from the very beginning advocating for those rights that they hold dear, for the cultural elements of their existence that make rural life livable. And we're going to continue to do that. And that's the message that we need to present, that we're here for you, local farmer, for your organic agricultural enterprise. We're here to help support you. We're here to help lift you up over and above the major agribusiness concerns that control your local representatives. We're here to ensure that everyone has adequate health care, that they're taken care of. And we're here to ensure that you're not cut off and isolated from the rest of the country, because we've got the solutions to bridge those large distances. To me, it really is just an effort of awareness and getting the word out. There are farmers all across this country that are angry. They are angry at the way things are going and how they have been forgotten. That's the reality. They just haven't gotten the messaging they need to hear from us. And so it remains for us to break through that wall and make those connections. Anyone else?
Yeah, a couple thousand more questions. So, have you ever heard of a thing called the People's Party?
I have.
What do you think about that game?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, we have a People's Party. It's called the Green Party.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, yes, there are some people, I guess, that have not heard of the Green Party, but what shocks me is how little momentum and popularity the Green Party has, given that the Green Party says everything that people need and want. So what I don't get really is why they're, I mean, I'm not guessing you could answer that question, but nationwide, I mean, yes, when you're talking about get the word out, I mean, the media is so overwhelming in terms of the right-wing propaganda. I don't know how anybody, anywhere, can get any word out. So are you thinking telegraph, or how are you thinking of radio? How could we get the word out?
You know, that's a great question, because I have to think about my own experience being a local representative in Youngstown, Ohio. I'm just a member of the school board, and I have to say that I've had a remarkable experience getting the word out with the media. I've been more successful than one would expect, especially in the context of just being a school board member. Over the past 4 years, I have gotten a great amount of media attention, locally at least, and then of course I got a lot of media attention nationally and internationally when I got canned from my job as a rabbi for supporting Palestinian rights. That story went all the way to Israel and back. It was in the Jerusalem Post. And so I guess one answer to that is to do things that are impactful, but also be savvy about how you get the word out and present it, because it didn't happen overnight that suddenly the media wanted to pay attention to the things that I was doing or saying and cover them. I had to learn how to package and present and connect with the media. And so when I do things, I send out press releases. How it works is that, first of all, the media is not going to just give you any free coverage and free publicity. You have to present a story that seems like something they want to publish because it feeds their corporate bottom line. The media is not a charity. They are a business. And so when you send out a savvy press release that looks like a story that their readers would want to read, that they could then also attach sponsors to and sell papers with, this is just the reality of the business. They will print it. And if it's well written, your press release, all the better, because it means less work for them. Some reporters will actually just wholesale print your press release. It saves them time.
Can you send us a copy of one of those beautiful press releases?
I can, absolutely. and so when you do that, you're building relationships with people too. And you have to recognize the people you're dealing with, even though they're part of a mega media conglomerate that's nameless and faceless. They are not nameless and faceless, they're human beings. And so you're building these connections with them, and once you build those human connections, they're more likely to also publish future stories about you, because you're not nameless and faceless anymore either. You are the local person in your community who's fighting for parents. You're the local person in your community who's fighting against environmental hazards. And your connection with them will condition them publicizing that. I had a very lovely circumstance that came out of the horrible circumstance of being canned for my stance on Israel. A local member of the media who had covered a number of my stories gave me a phone call when that story hit the press. And she said, I'm not calling for a story. I just wanted to call to let you know that I've always known you to be an honest person, and I've always known you to fight for people. And I'm so sorry that this happened to you, and then I'll be praying for you and thinking about you. I mean, think about the human connection and the human dimension there, and how that is a part of the connections that you make to get the word out, because the media is composed of people too. So we've had successes there, and those successes came about because of the hard work we put in making those connections, and the savvy and the training that went into media messaging. This is not always present in every green group, and that's not a criticism. That's just a recognition. And so we as a party need to invest in building up those skills, building up that savvy, building up those human connections, that human dimension, and utilizing that to get the word out and get the message out. That's one aspect. Because we are dealing with a media that is very bought out and bought and sold, and we have to do as much as we can to work around that particular barrier. But we also live in an age in which the internet has connected people like never before. And so, hashtag be the media. More than ever before, you can be the media. And this is spoken by someone who once ran a local radio show and public affairs TV show in my area. That was precisely why we were doing that, because we felt that even though we made these great connections with the media, they weren't covering the stories enough or from the right angle. And so we decided to be the media. You can do that through sharing things on your Facebook profile, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever, or you can do that by creating your own YouTube channel, your own shows, your own form of media that then people begin to trust and build up a following through. And if you do that, and your friends do that, and people do that all across the country, the democratization of information that's coming from the massive sharing on the internet has already begun to break through that blockade. And we can all be a part of that. So we should go out there and build those connections and start being the media. It's not going to be easy. I don't want to sell you a false bill of goods and tell you that, all overnight, by banding together, we are going to defeat the multi-million, billion-dollar media that is cramming down people's throats perspectives that are not in their best interest. But more than ever before, it's harder for them to shield people from the truth. People are finding the truth out, and let's just make it easier for them to do that. Anyone else?
Well, I have a specific question about glyphosate. We've been trying to, get it banned here, but do you think it will ever, with all the cases and the people have been getting multi-million-dollar winning, and so many thousands of people waiting in line to sue Bayer Monsanto. I just feel so discouraged that we can't even get it banned here on local, putting it into and copper into our water system that goes to all our farmers, including organic farmers, etc. And we go to their board meetings of it's called NID, Nevada Irrigation District, and we speak on our maximum 3 minutes, but I don't know, do you think